last lecture for the respiratory system. Yahoo, I can hear the cheering and the applause now. So let's go ahead and look at the first slide. This is a relatively short unit, our lecture on ventilation, perfusion, coupling. So we're back to capillaries. And this whole story is at the pulmonary capillaries, where ventilation is occurring, of course, and where the pulmonary blood flow is occurring. So ventilation is pretty straightforward. It's just moving air in and out of the alveoli. Perfusion is just pushing blood through tissues. So this is pushing the blood through the pulmonary capillaries. And the idea is, well, here, ventilation is just denoted with a V. That makes sense, V for ventilation. Perfusion uses a Q. Don't ask me why. If I were to do it, I may have said P for perfusion, but it's Q for perfusion. And normally, ventilation and perfusion are matched. There's no units to this. It's all relative, and it's the idea that you want them to be matched. So if you have adequate ventilation to the lungs, you want an adequate blood supply. On the other hand, if ventilation is reduced for some reason in a particular spot in the lungs, then you reduce the perfusion in that area. So this occurs only at the pulmonary capillaries, and I should say probably in a small area. So we're not talking about the entire lungs. So small areas only. So there's some adjustment that goes on. And the other thing to note is, and remember, is that this is not what's occurring in the systemic tissues, out in your fingers and your toes and everywhere else. So the goal, as I mentioned before, if ventilation is reduced, perhaps it's a small obstruction in the airway, then perfusion must be reduced. And what you're after is sort of a one-to-one relationship. So for example, as I mentioned, if ventilation is reduced, let's say to 0.5, then perfusion gets reduced to 0.5 also. We have 0.5 over 0.5, and we still have 1. So everything's good, assuming the perfusion's not, or the obstruction is not significant. But that's the goal, that's the idea. On the other hand, if perfusion is reduced to, let's say, I don't know, arbitrarily say 0.4 of what it used to be, perhaps it's a small pulmonary embolism that clotted some of the areas, so some of the lung tissue is not being perfused, then it makes sense to reduce the ventilation. Why send good air to a poorly perfused area of the lung? And so they both get reduced to 0.4, and we're back to unity, and we're still at 1-to-1. Everything's good. Okay, so that's the goal, is to match ventilation and to perfusion. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but let me point out, I'm going to go to a blank page, that there are areas in the lungs where there are normal VQ mismatches. So let's say that some areas of the lung have, I'm going to change the size of this marker, have normal VQ mismatch, where it's not 1-to-1. And this occurs, some of these areas of the lung are at the apex and at the base. where you see areas of ventilation, perfusion, VQ mismatch. So at the apex of the lung, what happens, and this is generally at rest, so at the apex, you can think of the blood, the top and the bottom. The blood tends to pool at the bottom. And so it tends to drain out of the top. So there's not as much blood that works its way up to the top, because the blood vessels come in about mid-level at the hilum, and it's easiest for the blood just to drop by gravity to the base of the lung. So they tend to get better perfusion at the base and tend not to get as good of perfusion at the apex. So at the apex, let's say ventilation is normal. So let's say that it's 1, but perfusion is reduced due to the gravitational column, if you will, of blood. Let's say it goes down to 0.5. Okay, so what's the VQ ratio? It's 1 over 0.5, which equals 2. So here we have a VQ ratio of 2, and this is greater than 1. So this is how it's often expressed. The VQ ratio equal to 1, less than 1, or greater than 1. So if the VQ ratio is greater than 1, as 2, what does that tell you? Well, ventilation exceeds perfusion. Okay. At the base of the lungs, it's pretty much the opposite. Good blood flow, but the little air spaces, the tiny little bronchioles, tend to be flattened and collapsed by all the blood that's pooled down there. So the VQ ratio there, let's say perfusion is still good, so we'll keep it at 1, but the ventilation is down. Some of those tiny little bronchioles have been squished due to the blood column, and that then equals 0.5. So now we have a VQ mismatch, a ratio that's less than 1. So if the VQ ratio is less than 1, it tells you that perfusion exceeds ventilation. Okay, let's go back to a slide that I had prepared. This one, sort of a graphic representation of what we're talking about. And this is the normal picture. So normal perfusion of blood past the alveoli. So here is our low oxygen blood coming into the pulmonary arteries, going to the lungs, and here are the alveoli, and we're doing the gas exchange. Carbon dioxide, and oxygen back and forth. The bronchioles are open, and the ventilation is good, and the perfusion is good to maximize gas exchange. That's great. Okay. And just remember what we're looking at again. These are pulmonary capillaries. I'm abbreviating, pull caps. The next slide shows change. So let's just stick with the one on the left first. And what we have is some sort of obstruction, something that reduces the ventilation. So notice that the bronchiole has gotten smaller. It's constricted. So that area of the lungs is not ventilated adequately. Well, do the changes in gases make sense? If we can't ventilate the lungs, the CO2 is going to build up. Because remember where the CO2 is coming from? It's coming from the blood. It's coming from the tissues, and we're trying to get rid of the blood, or we're trying to get rid of the carbon dioxide, but the bronchioles obstructed, so the CO2 builds up, the oxygen goes down because we can't get oxygen into the alveoli. Well, so here's an area of poorly ventilated lung. What's the goal? To keep them matched is to reduce the perfusion to that area. So the slide or the image on the right shows what has happened. And the bronchiole has constricted. So here's bronchoconstriction, reduced ventilation, and through local mechanisms that we'll look at next, the blood vessel has constricted. So we have vasoconstriction. This is normal. Again, we're trying to match the ventilation to perfusion. So poor ventilation, well, poor perfusion. Don't send the blood to this area of the lungs where it's going to be ineffective. Shunt that blood somewhere else to where the exchange is still normal. That's the goal. And the next slide that we look at, and I believe this is the last slide, yes, of this entire module, is looking at the local control mechanisms. How do we regulate the bronchial diameter and the arterial diameter at the capillaries? Because either one could change. We could reduce perfusion, and then we would need to reduce ventilation. So let's go to the last slide. Okay, so we have two things to regulate, the bronchioles and the arterioles. Both of these are lined with smooth muscle. Both have the ability to constrict and dilate. So let's look at the bronchioles first. So the bronchial diameter is determined primarily by the amount of exhaled CO2. So it's the amount of CO2 in the lumen of the bronchiole, and that affects the smooth muscle. Okay, so think about this for a moment. If we have increased CO2 in the bronchioles, what would you like the bronchioles to do to get rid of the CO2? You want them to dilate. So increased carbon dioxide in the bronchioles then leads to bronchodilation to get rid of it. That should make sense. Okay. Conversely, if we have decreased CO2 in the bronchioles, well, then it's the opposite. We'll get bronchoconstriction. So think about the one, perhaps, I think this one makes more sense. What are we doing here? Let's put a star. And then with decreased CO2, it'll be the opposite. So more CO2, open up the airways. So what's happening? CO2 is causing the bronchiolar smooth muscle to relax, and then the bronchioles dilate. Okay, so bronchioles are controlled by CO2 levels. Arterioles, on the other hand, leading into the capillaries, the smooth muscle of the arterioles is sensitive to the oxygen level around them in the ISF. So, if we have decreased oxygen in the ISF, so what would lead to decreased oxygen in the ISF? So here is a alveolus, and here is a pulmonary capillary, and here is the ISF. So what would cause a decrease of oxygen in the ISF? Well, you know that oxygen is flowing from the alveoli into the ISF. So if there's low oxygen in the interstitial fluid, it's probably due to a blockage in the airway. That's a blockage. So if we have reduced ventilation, then what do we want to do at the capillaries? Constrict. So if decreased oxygen in the ISF, then vasoconstrict. And this then gets narrower. We're constricting. We have reduced ventilation is down, and now we have reduced perfusion that's down. That's the idea. And then the opposite also. If we have increased O2 in the ISF, then vasodilate. That's a rather weak response because the blood vessels are already mostly fully dilated anyway. So again, I think I would focus on this one for learning. It makes sense, I think. Okay, so work with that. Those are the control mechanisms for the arterioles and the bronchioles. Something before we leave this. This is exactly the opposite of what happens in the systemic capillaries with regard to oxygen. So be clear what's happening to the pulmonary capillaries, the arterioles, when we have low oxygen. They constrict in the lungs. What happens out in the tissues when you have low oxygen? Low O2 in tissues. Just the opposite. Here you want the blood vessels to dilate. So that will lead to vasodilation. Does that make sense? The muscles are running out of oxygen. O2 is low in the ISF. Dilate the blood vessels and more oxygen is delivered. Okay, that's it for this module on the respiratory system. And if you have questions, I have office hours online through Zoom. I'm tending not to see a lot of people there. I'm tending, as usual, not to get a lot of questions. It's usually just a few students that are asking questions. The vast majority of you I haven't really heard from, so I'm hoping for the best. But please, if you have questions, get a hold of me. Either shoot me an email or get on to the office hours, and I'll try to give you as much help as I can. Thanks. We'll see you soon. Bye.